All right, and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Shaun and Ari Discuss Israel. Welcome back, Shaun.
Thanks, Ari. Good to be back.
Good to be here. Just a little announcement. Now that we have partnered with the Jerusalem Media Group, we are going to be changing the name of the show to Boots on the Ground, Insights into Israel's War, Politics, and Identity. How do you feel about that, Shaun?
Sounds good. Let's go.
It's great to start the new show. It's great to start fresh almost. But it's the same Shaun, the same Ari, and it's the same insights. So,
right. Looking forward to a couple of discussions, disagreements, but all for the greater good.
Exactly. Before we get into today's episode, where we're going to just do a quick overview of where things stand in Israel and a little bit of insights into the separate fronts of the wars that we're fighting, we want to say thank you to BeThereIsrael.com, which it provides video broadcasting and streaming services for live events here in Israel. And they're the sponsors of our show this week. All right, Shaun, let's get into it. We'll start with the north, Lebanon and Syria, then we'll make our way around to Iran, and then we'll go down to Gaza. So let's start off. What's our current situation, where things stand on the northern front, the Lebanon-Syria area?
Okay, so important to know that there are two significant changes in Israel's northern border. And we need to look at Syria separately and Iran separately. And specifically, Syria is actually going to be more significant in the coming week because Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be traveling to Washington to meet with President Trump. And there is a very good chance that we'll discuss something about some type of more permanent resolution to what is going on in Syria. For those who don't know, a couple of months ago, the Syrian government under Assad completely collapsed. There is a new interim leadership under a
terrorist.
Under a guy by the name of Julani, who has an interesting past. He was previously in Al-Qaeda, and before that, after that, he was also part of ISIS. But now he has rebranded himself as a pro-Western potential savior of Syria. But with all of this, Israel also didn't want to take any chances, so we used the collapse of Assad to move into the entire Hermon area. So we now have a semi-permanent IDF base in Syria, and there are other areas along the Golan Heights where Israel has actually moved beyond the ceasefire lines that we signed with Syria in 1974 to establish significant control over the strategic areas actually into Syria. That is where we are at the moment. Also important to note that Israel pretty much destroyed the last remnants of the Syrian Air Force and its tank regiments. That today, Syria is no longer a strategic threat to Israel at all.
So moving forward, it looks like we have a unofficial ceasefire then with the powers that be in Syria. We have our strategic positions that we value and view as important. We're holding them and not going anywhere. And even if Netanyahu comes back from Washington without an official ceasefire, the situation on the Syrian border seems fairly stable. And we can continue in the status quo that we've now created indefinitely.
Yes. And it's important to know, we're going to discuss the idea of achievements and goals and what does a victory look like. In Syria, this is exactly what victory looks like. We are in Syrian territory, not very far in, enough to control the strategic areas. The Syrian government, whatever you want to call it, has no ability to threaten Israel. And even if they had the motivation, they don't have the means. Alternatively, even if they had the means, they don't have the motivation. That is very important. The flip side of all of this is right now we have Julani, who is the interim leader. He could go on to be another Arab dictator, which is probably going to happen. But there is constantly the threat in Syria, like there are in other Arab countries, that there could be another militant faction that emerges within the coming weeks, months, or even years. And they take it upon themselves not only to fight the dictatorship in Syria, but also to try and launch attacks at us. That is always the reality on Israel's borders.
But that's always going to be the reality on Israel borders. There's always going to be enemies. The question is now that we hold the strategic positions in southern Syria or northern Israel, now that we hold those strategic positions, it's much more complicated or difficult for any faction that would arise to then threaten the state of Israel. Because again, we're in the advantageous position that we weren't in beforehand geographically, which also provides a level of another layer of defense that we didn't have beforehand.
Exactly. So that brings us now to Lebanon, where the situation is a little different. Do you want to speak about that?
Well, I haven't gone up to Lebanon yet. I'll be going up there for another beginnings of reserve duty in about 2.5, 3 weeks for 3 months. When I come back, I'm sure I'll know a lot more than I know now. So why don't you just lay out our position in Lebanon, and then we'll talk about that for a minute, because that's where I think you and I are going to differ on our opinions of what victory looks like in Lebanon.
Okay, so let's start off with what the reality is in Lebanon right now. The way I see it, Hezbollah as a military force has been almost decimated. It has no real leadership anymore. From Nasrallah all the way down, the leadership has been killed. Most of their commanders are either dead or literally incapacitated so that they cannot lead anybody into any military campaigns. Israel has also maintained 5 strategic hilltops in southern Lebanon, where they can control the flow of individuals and even make sure that there is no weaponry flowing in. And we also, over the last couple of months, since the ceasefire went into effect, a ceasefire brokered by President Trump between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel has taken initiative even over the last few hours whenever Hezbollah operatives attempt to operate in and around southern Lebanon, even when Hamas operatives are moving around openly in Beirut, they're being attacked either by Israeli drones or fighter jets, or in some cases even by commando units, which is a significant change, because if we go back to 2 years ago, before the upheavals, Hezbollah openly put tents on the Israeli border where they were training soldiers. They were building arsenals on the Israeli border. And the Israeli government hemmed and hawed and was too scared to even ask the United Nations to deal with these tents. Today, a minor Hezbollah operatives moves a fingernail into the ceasefire lines and we blow him up with a drone. We don't even think about it.
Right. But at the same time, there's a level of ambiguity and uncertainty of what's going to be in Lebanon. Because again, eventually, if we don't maintain the current situation, if at any point we stop maintaining that level of awareness and preparedness and response, Hezbollah can regroup and rebuild, or Hezbollah 2 or 3 or some other attrition of that reality can come back to create us and then threaten our northern border with Lebanon again, where there's a level of uncertainty that we've created that can't go on indefinitely. It's not like with Syria, because there is still the infrastructure of Hezbollah. There is still the infrastructure to an extent for the military material that's now just much further north in Lebanon that could come back and bite us.
That you're right. That potential, unfortunately, will always be there. It doesn't matter whether it's Lebanon. Like I said, the situation in Syria can change overnight. Even in Jordan, that situation can change. That is unfortunate, a constant reality, but that it doesn't necessarily revolve around us. That is the problem with very much in the Arab world, that there can be a new militia, a new strongman, a new terrorist group that emerges wherever. And there's very little we can do to change that.
Right. So
the best opportunity that Israel has would be the stability of the country or the regime. The more stable Syria becomes in the coming years, the more stable, the better it is for Israel. The less stable that Lebanon has been over the last 20 years has been worse for Israel. Right now, with Hezbollah in retreat, not only militarily in Israel, but also in their headquarters in Beirut, and with U.S. support, Hezbollah are constantly being pushed out of the government, out of their central role. Lebanon is becoming strategically more stable as a country. It is better for Israel. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to have this massive peace agreement and we're going to be traveling to Beirut and going to hotels there. No, that's not going to happen probably within our lifetime, as much as we'd like to see it. But if the country stabilizes and we maintain our militant vigilance, yes, the potential for another outbreak, like you're saying, becomes less and less.
Right, but it requires us to do the maintenance. And I think that's where I'm less hopeful that in the long term, not the next year or two, but the next 5, 10, 15 years, that Israel's going to be up to the challenge to maintain that level of maintenance. Because unlike Syria, where we're now in a topographically and geographically very strong position, there's no civilian population in the areas that we're holding except for the Druze population, which is very much allied with us. The southern Syria is a different situation. The topography in some areas to our benefit, some areas is not. The population is very much not our friends, and it requires a much higher level of vigilance and a much larger investment in resources, whether it's manpower or other military resources, to do that maintenance in Lebanon. And I think over the long run, as we've seen in every other situation that Israel's been in historically, we tend to hit really hard, really fast. But then when it comes to maintaining that victory, eventually we get tired of it and we move on and we let our guard down, and then we end up back where we started from. So I think the fact that we required such a high level of maintenance to maintain the security in Lebanon, I think that's where we're going to have our problem in the long run. I hope to be proven wrong.
Okay, I understand your concerns on this, but the way I see it, this comes down to.
I don't think there's a better solution. I think I'm agreeing with you. I just don't. I have a fear. I'm not disagreeing with you, and I don't think that there is a better option at the moment.
Okay, so this is one of the aspects I see is, and this we can probably bring this into Gaza pretty soon, is one of the ongoing discussions in Israel with those who are pro-Netanyahu and the government opposition is this idea that, well, what does victory look like? You have the defeatist attitude that there's no image of victory. We'll never get a perfect victory in Gaza, and Netanyahu and all of his ministers are living in a dream world because there's no image of victory like 67 or anything else. You're never going to see the Tzanchanim at the Kotel and we know we've won. I actually disagree with that, and I'm using Lebanon and Syria and then Gaza as examples of that. The image of victory in every battlefront is different. But the image of victory that I see in Lebanon is exactly that. You have the leadership of Hezbollah decimated and dead, and their senior commanders are either dead, have no eyes and no arms, or both, or in some cases, all three. They have no ability or even desire to fight with us. And that was proven over the last 2 weeks, where Iran invested billions and billions in their little proxy Hezbollah, so that when time comes, not only could Hezbollah invade Israel, but Hezbollah could be there to serve and harass Israel and launch massive military or even missile attacks into Israel. We just went through 12 days of war, and Hezbollah was silent, even if they wanted to.
Well, they went a step further. They publicly announced that they're not coming to the aid of Iran.
And that is absolute victory in the north.
I don't know if
that is the image of victory in the north.
Right, but I also think that that's saying that that's good enough. I think that that's not necessarily victory. It's a win for now. I wouldn't say it's victory. I think the last time on the historic map that we've seen victory was the West, the Western world against Germany and Japan. I think that was the last time we've had clear victory, militarily, politically, however you want to define it, in history. I think since then, everything has been shades of gray between victory and not victory. There's never been a clear-cut victory in anything since then, at least that I'm aware of.
I agree with you.
I also think up north, we're calling it victory, but it's not, we won, the other side surrendered, or they don't exist anymore. We control the territory. Their population is now assimilating and becoming our friends, and they're accepting our way of life, and we're all going to the beach in Beirut for vacation. That's not going to happen, and that's never going to happen. I'm not sure if victory is the right word, but we're definitely winning.
Okay. I'll accept most of what you're saying. Yes. I wouldn't say we've won this. We've won till now.
Right.
And back to what you said
I also
before.
don't think in Syria and Lebanon we need to have a total clear victory. I think the situation we have right now is the best we can expect from now.
So exactly what you're saying.
Right.
Good enough.
It's good enough, right?
Good enough for now.
But I wouldn't call it victory. I'd say it's good enough for now. And we can drop it down to a much lower point on our priority list of things we have to deal with. And we can come back in a more advantageous time in the future and hopefully achieve the victory in a political sense instead of having to invest more military resources.
Right. Look, for now,
Being
I
hopeful
agree.
for the future.
For now, I wouldn't even say good enough. For now, we've achieved just
It's
about
great.
everything we can.
For now, we're in a great position
And like
on our
I said,
northern border.
and the proof is that Hezbollah were impotent over the last 12 days.
Right. It wasn't just they were impotent, it's not just they couldn't. They publicly said they wouldn't. That there's a difference between not doing anything, and they came out and made a statement saying, no, we're sitting this one out, guys.
Right.
I think that was a victory. That specific is a victory, and I think that's going to lead to move forward. But let's move on to Iran now.
Okay. So based on that idea, we have what happened in Iran.
Right.
So you and I were called to reserve duty, surprisingly,
Yep.
2 weeks ago. Not given any details, although it was very clear, because the Israeli government under Prime Minister Netanyahu had decided now was the time to strike at Iran as hard as possible to prevent any breakout of nuclear ability and to decimate the Iranian ability to create nuclear weapons and threaten Israel.
Well, they also took a step further. It wasn't just the nuclear program. It was also the ballistic missile program, which is what we suffered from over those 12 days. It was to remove that ability. And I think that before we get into what victory in Iran would look like, I want to just say here, it's a lot of times people will criticize the government, and you and I definitely have criticized a lot, but I also think it's really important to give credit where credit is due. In addition to the phenomenal success that the army, the Mossad, and everyone involved had in Iran, I think one huge lesson that was learned from October 7th that both you and I now experienced is that the army decided to be proactive, not wait till something bad happened and be reactive. The army said, okay, we're attacking Iran. We know that there's now potential for all of our enemies to come out of the woodwork, whether it be on the northern border or even on our eastern border with Jordan, which we were sent to, or Judea and Samaria or along Gaza. And the army preemptively instead of reactively called up an enormous amount of reservists to strengthen every single flashpoint that could become a problem if they decide to act up, and have those forces already there, ready to deal with anything they can, instead of reacting to once there's a problem already existing. And I think part of that is why we saw no major flare-ups anywhere outside of our battles in and around Iran.
Right. I think there's a strategic idea that friends of mine have been discussing, and it goes like this. The role of the army is to bring violence upon our enemies, whoever and wherever they are. That is the goal of the army.
Right.
Bring violence and destruction on our enemies. The role of the government is to turn up and down that volume. The government are the people who are supposed to rein in the army or let the army loose. The army is not supposed to be a political organization that decides, can we go, should we go? They should be ready to go and bring death and destruction to our enemies at any minute.
Right. Like how I said, the army is a hammer and everything's a nail.
Yes.
There's no other option.
Right.
I'm a hammer and everything's a nail. All we want to do is bash everything.
Right. And it's the role of the government to decide how to use the army.
Exactly. It's our role of the government to tell that hammer, this isn't a nail, this is a glass cup. This we don't smash.
Exactly. So I think that's exactly what happened over the last 2 weeks is the government kind of just released the brakes and said, go smash.
Exactly.
And starting from the
And they
very
did it
beginning,
spectacularly.
it was incredible.
And so now before we get into that, I also want to point out one other thing that's been talked about less is this wasn't just a battle of Israel versus Iran. And it wasn't just protecting Israel from Iranian's nuclear program. We just did a huge service for the entire Western world, not just in destroying the nuclear program in Iran. Because again, the nuclear program in Iran didn't threaten the United States or London or France. But in the end of the day, we just pit Western American technology up against the best technology of the Eastern Bloc, whether it's Russia, China, Iran together. We just pit the F-35I up against the remaining S-300 and the Iranian, Russian, Chinese air defense system and all of their technology. And we proved that not only are we superior to them, but that we are far superior to them, to the point where they didn't even get off one missile against any of our planes. We knocked the little bit of their air force out of the sky and the remaining planes on the ground. We decimated, absolutely decimated their air defense systems to the point where they don't exist. We were refueling planes over Iranian airspace. That is the most vulnerable place for a plane to be.
Right. And important to point out, the refueling aircraft that Israel used, for those who know, are 707s. It's a airframe that's over 50 years old. So we were using 50-year-old refueling planes and flying them over Syria and Iran without any hindrance.
Exactly. So I think that when we look at the conflict in a global sense for a minute, you know, what does America get out of this? What does the West, that I would consider us part of the liberal Judeo-Christian Western world, you know, what was it that was so important for Trump to get involved and for the other countries that did help us along the way? I think it was a proof of concept. It was that, you know, what we have can stand up to what our global enemies possess, and we did it spectacularly.
Right. And that goes back to what I said.
And we did that and no one had any skin in it. Up until the American bombings in Iran, we took all the risk, and by the time the Americans got involved, there was no risk left for them. Yeah. There was the you know, the return on investment, you know, calculation there was so easy.
Yeah. So this goes back to what we said before about Lebanon, Syria, is what is the picture of victory in Iran? And we may disagree on this, but I see the victory exactly as this. Iran has no real nuclear ability left. Their air defense system is completely decimated. Their military was proven not only to the world, but also internally to be incapable. To the fact that that Iran is forced to create some type of fake military parade to claim that they won. That just shows how bad the situation is. Conversely, over the last 12 days, and even now, Israel's economy has grown. The shekel, much to our dismay, is stronger than it was 6 months ago. And Iran's economy has been decimated again. That is victory. We have won this. I do not, like in Syria and Lebanon, did not, and I still do not want there to be this decimation and a regime change. I don't even want the Ayatollah to be killed. He is a shaky, horrible, evil old man who will one day meet his end at the hands of the Iranian people. It shouldn't be Israel who has anything to do with that. Our victory is exactly like this. It was very similar to the way it was with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have no desire to continue fighting with us. They can only lose. And when President Trump came around and said, "This is it, ceasefire," yes, good enough. We have achieved our goals. We've won.
So I disagree with you a little bit. I don't think Israel needs to be overtly and out there involved in regime change. I would assume we still have operatives on the ground in Iran on some level that there's still things they can do to help that process along and make it move a little faster. I think Dafka with Iran, victory needs to be the total disintegration of Iran as a country. I think that after being the largest state sponsor of terrorism, the head of all the people trying to kill us and destroy us, I think that we need to make an even bigger example out of them to ward off any of our enemies in the future. Not to deter them, but to say, this is what happens to the country that makes its entire national purpose the destruction of the Jewish people. We have to make a stronger example. Like, Iran is made up of multiple different ethnic classes. You have the Kurds in the north. and you have the Turks and the Arabs and the Muslims and the Persians, and they make up a very, it's a very diverse, very patchworked country in the end of the day. And I think that we need to help encourage behind the scenes, not overtly, not Israel came and destroyed the regime now at this point, but we have to create and ferment the ability for the Iranian people to overthrow their own current regime and let the country devolve back into separate areas. The Kurds in the north, we could have a great relationship with. We could have diplomatic, recognize them as a country, strengthen them. And all the different divergent groups that would come up, let Iran break apart as a country. Not one entity anymore, but let it fall apart, disassemble itself, demolish itself, break down back into its smallest pieces. And I think we need to make that example of them, both on a global level, like this is what happens when you mess with us, and also internally, where it's like not only did we win this one, but for ourselves to regain our own pride and hold our own hand. This is what we do. The ultimate enemy, we don't just beat you, we absolutely, utterly, and totally demolish you back to the point where your level in history, your book is closed, and a new chapter is open on that geographical piece of land.
Okay, I disagree with almost everything you've said there.
Okay.
One, Iran is far more homogeneous than the rest of the Arab world. The Persian world is far more unified than we imagine. Yes, there is a small Turkish and Kurdish population. Yes, there's a small Arab population. Persia and Iran are far more unified and solidified than the rest of the Islamic world and certainly the Arab world. The idea of breaking it up into smaller is not going to happen. That's one.
Okay.
Two, exactly what happened in the other countries. The last thing you want is a large military to be in the country to get decimated into small militias and small strongmen. That is the last thing you want, especially in a large militarized country like Iran. It is what led to the big problems in Iran. It was led to all the problems in Lebanon and what led to the emergence of Hezbollah as the strong party. It is what is part of the problem today in Yemen, where the country has splintered into different factions, and one faction decided to take up missiles and launch them at us, and there's very little we can do to stop that. It is what happened in Iraq, that even though the Americans are quite happy about what happened in Iraq, still today you have splinter factions in Iraq, and some of them are still actually joining with the Houthis and have been firing drones at us. The last thing I want is for Iran to be in that situation. Yes. I do not want that to happen at all in Iran.
You and I will disagree on that one then.
Okay. So I said, I'm just going to read. I think it's, firstly, you're underestimating how unified the population is, and secondly, I don't want it to happen.
Okay. So I think, maybe I'm wrong on how unified they are as a population, and maybe just the absolute and total collapse of the current regime is good enough.
Yeah.
But which I'd be happy with as well. But I think that the disintegration of Iran as a country, whether that means it breaks up into lots of little pieces or it gets a new leadership and a new regime, I think the concept needs to be made that there needs to be an example made out of them that's more extreme and stronger than every one of our other enemies at the moment.
Okay, so we'll disagree on that, but now let's come all the way down to Gaza.
Wonderful.
Right, the way you see it, where are we? What is happening? And more importantly, where do we go from here?
So I don't think we're really anywhere different than the last time we spoke, realistically on the ground. We were both very hopeful that with a new chief of staff and, the new reality, this like there is infused this new
call it an ethos, a gung-ho fighting
right, there's
attitude.
A new fighting spirit that was brought back into the army that had been lost for a while in Gaza with a new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, coming in to replace Herzl Levy, that we were going to see some real changes. They made all these announcements. We have 5 divisions in Gaza. We're controlling the areas now. We're going in and we're not going out.
Which is exactly what you spoke about before it happened, by the way.
What?
You spoke exactly about that on our previous podcast when we spoke about it. You'd mentioned 5 divisions going in, doing everything.
And in the end of the day, there was all talk. And it hasn't really materialized. And the reality in the end of the day is we're still providing humanitarian aid into northern Gaza, which will be empty of residents. We still go in and out of different areas for 1,000,001 reasons. We have 5 divisional headquarters. We don't have 5 full divisions in Gaza. The reality isn't much different. The army's announced that it controls 70% of Gaza right now. Okay, well, of the 30% that's remaining, about 20% of it is the coastal area, that's the humanitarian zone, which in theory, our hostages shouldn't be there. And there's the remaining 10%, which is like what's called the central camps, the Machanot Milkaz, which is where, in theory, all of our hostages are. Now, if we have 5 divisions in Gaza, we should be able to clear out that 10% of land that's remaining, find our hostages, bring the ones who's alive, bring home and let them rebuild their lives. The ones who are no longer with us, bring them home for an appropriate burial. And then we can move on to some sort of solution for Gaza after that. The reality is we're not doing that. The current government isn't telling the army to go do that. The army isn't pushing the government to tell them to go do that. So I don't really think we're in a very different position. Trump's announcing that he has some great plan and some great deal on the table with Hamas that's about to, next week there'll be great news coming out of Washington. I'll believe it when I see it. And I think that in the end of the day, a lot of the gray area, this treading water that we have in Gaza is a lack of political resolve in Israel. That there's been no political decision of what is going to be with Gaza in the end of the day. Let's say we flip the switch, the war is over tomorrow. If we can have whatever we want solution, no one's decided what that solution should be, or no one's accepted what solution that's going to be yet. And therefore, the army is doing what it needs to do. It's having successes where it can. It's making headway in small ways where possible, but it's basically treading water to not overly invest itself too much if we're just going to pull out of it in a deal anyways. That's where I see things standing. And we'll wait to see what happens, what comes out of Washington next week. And I think it's absurd that we have to wait for what comes out of Washington next week to change things in Gaza.
Yeah. So we've spoken throughout this episode of what victory looks like. And I'd said before, victory in Syria looks different to victory in Lebanon, which looks different to victory in Gaza and different to Iran. Everyone is speaking about the day after in Gaza, the day after in Gaza. I'm less worried about the day after Gaza. I want today. There is actually a very clear picture of victory. Not everyone will agree with me, not everyone likes it, but this is what needs to happen. We need to get all our hostages back, either alive or no longer with us. We have all of them. Every single hostage that was taken on October 7th is back home, either for an appropriate burial or back home with their families, as you said, to rebuild their lives. That's one. 2, and not even less important or more important, is every member of Hamas is either dead or is giving up their arms or is running away because they no longer have the desire or the ability to fight. Every Hamas leader is either dead or turning himself over to Israeli authorities. That is the victory. That is what it should look like at the end. After that, we can discuss rebuilding Gaza and everything else, whether it's reoccupation, but it needs to be that is the end goal is that. The absolute decimation of Hamas, its ability to fight, and the repatriation of all hostages.
So I want to add something onto that. I think that one thing that people are a little bit afraid to talk about that I think is a very important piece, in addition to everything you're saying, is that there needs to be Israeli military control of Gaza. Before we talk about other entities controlling Gaza or coming in, I think we have to establish the fact that they surrendered and they're now subservient to Israeli military rule as an important first step before we allow other foreign entities to come in and start controlling and start rebuilding and start blah, blah, blah. I think we need to have that day where there's the Israeli flag flying over every major commercial center, there's the Israeli flag flying above everything, Israeli military rule where Gazans are required to turn to the Israeli military for their existence. I think that even though there's the American, the fund for the, what's called the
Gaza Humanitarian Fund,
the GHF, which is an American initiative, while that's fine and wonderful, I think there needs to first come a stage in this process where the Gazans receive it directly from a uniformed Israeli soldier, is the one who's giving them the ability to exist for a short period of time as a first step before we move on to whatever comes next.
I agree with, again, look, I think our differences there are a little bit nuanced. But more importantly than all of that is, let's go back to what I said previously. The role of the army in Gaza is to hit the nail as hard as possible, as often as possible. The army needs to be a rolling mass thunder, fire and brimstone
Yes.
and ammunition, and destroy as much as possible. I know it sounds cruel and horrible. It is there to destroy and decimate. It is not there to hold back and think. And the role of the government is to think and hold back and redirect the army. The army should be rolling thunder and lightning into Gaza all the time. And for some reason, they've gone back to their old habits of holding back and waiting. And that is leading to this exact same situation where we're pretty much in the same, we're playing the same tape over and over since for the last year and a half of go in, wait, kind of, go back, go in, wait, kind of, go. We're not achieving, it's almost like we don't want to achieve that victory. We're scared of those pictures, like you said, of the Israeli flag flying over central Khan Yunis, of long rows of Hezbollah,
I think there's a lack of will on the political side. There's a lack of will to achieve victory, because victory comes with responsibility. Victory means owning it. It means, in the end of the day, you're going to have military rule for some short amount of time. And I think on the political front, there's a lack of willpower to do that. We can make up 1,001 reasons and excuses of why, but I think the reality is there's a lack of political willpower. And I think there's a lack of vision in Israel's political leadership at the moment. I think that we got stuck with a group of leadership that, because we had relative peace for so many years, we stopped looking for leaders with vision. We stopped looking for leaders with really strong ideology. There's Netanyahu there. There's really no one else up there with him with any real depth of vision for Israel's future or any real depth of ideological drive alongside him. And then that means when Netanyahu doesn't have anyone like that alongside him or to keep him in check, he's left to be Netanyahu, who's the king of not making a decision, who's the king of treading water, who's the king of, I'm playing 3D chess and thinking 30 stages ahead. Sure. What about right now? Okay. Like sometimes you have to be a little bit short-sighted in order to get to the long-term decisions. And I think that we're in a little bit of a political stalemate right now, or stagnation, that, is going to come to a head pretty soon, definitely in the next year and a half. And hopefully we'll see some real political change at that point.
Well, we've always liked to end on something positive. I think you just did. I'm going to end on my positive note is like this. 3 years ago, and certainly after October 7th, there was the general idea that if, God forbid, there is any type of war between Israel and Iran, it would be catastrophic.
On the home front.
On the home front. It would be catastrophic. There'd be hundreds of thousands of missiles, thousands of casualties, dozens of buildings destroyed. Hezbollah would get involved and the entire north could have been invaded. Just terrible, terrible things were pictured, even by the more optimistic areas of Israel. And the reality is, today we're sitting in Jerusalem, sipping coffee, and yes, we did take missiles, and 25 Israelis were murdered by Iran, and a number of buildings were taken down. But we proved our resilience as a people. We went back to school, we went back to work, we finished our reserve duty, we're doing our jobs. We're rebuilding, the economy's moving along, and even the most horrific predictions weren't even close to true. I want to even say this is our generation's wake-up call of imagine how great things will be in the future. This is our vision of moving forward. Things are really, really moving in a positive direction. The worst predictions didn't come true, and the best is yet to come.
So, on my positive note, I want to say that one of the biggest lessons that I've taken away from this war is that the younger generation, you and I were already in our 40s. I just had a birthday, so I'm now 41.
Yeah, kids.
Exactly. But I know at least in reserve duty, we always looked at the younger generation as, the generation of TikTok, the generation of the internet, where they're all about being an influencer. They don't have the stamina to really fight a war like a previous generation. Now, again, I'm sure our grandparents looked at us that way, as is their grandparents looked at them that way after every, major incident. And I think this war has shown that it's not just that our generation we've still got some fight left in us. It's that the younger generation has far surpassed anything any of us could have imagined that they were capable of. Their resilience, their drive, their love of the country, their love of their people is so extraordinary that it inspires me. And seeing that that's who the next generation coming up after us, that's who they are, it puts me in a good place that I know we're in good hands, that we have a bright future. Not just that what could be, it's that I know it's going to be bright. I know it's going to be amazing because I've now seen firsthand what this generation is capable of under extremely stressful situations and terrible, terrible realities. This is what they do. And they're all still, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority, they're still happy. They're still smiling. They're still optimistic for the future. And that makes me proud and me happy to be an Israeli and a Jew today, sitting here in Jerusalem recording with you, Shaun.
All right. Well,
and on that note, again, I want to say thank you to the Jerusalem Media Group and remind everybody that today's episode is being sponsored by BeThereIsrael.com, live streaming and event services for family and events in Israel. And all our viewers, remember our show is now Boots on the Ground, insights into Israel's war, politics, and identity. And we look forward to seeing you again next week and sharing more and more of our discussions with you. From us here in Jerusalem to you at home, have a great day, and Am Yisrael Chai.